Please, not now.
We're starving!
You promised us food.
I need my child.
Jonah lunged for the boiled roots. Desperation drove his small fingers across the rim of the cracked bowl. A neighbor's palm closed over his wrist and jerked the portion away. Maria, the voice snapped, low and steady. The boy collapsed onto the damp yard, gasping, and Maria's hands tightened on the ladle as if she could gather pieces of him back. Thomas stood at the kitchen threshold and watched the theft happen before he had time to move. He felt the need to act, the weight of choice pressing at his ribs. Desperation hung in the air like steam off the pot. It pushed at every face in the yard. He did not speak yet. He counted rations in his head by motion. 1 cracked bowl, 2 slices of thin bread, a half scoop of nettle broth measured for 4. The yard smelled of wet straw and smoke. A child made a sound that was neither cry nor complaint. Maria wiped Jonah's mouth with the back of her hand and said only, "Not tonight." The voice was plain. It did not plead. The neighbor's hand retreated. Old Halden stood apart with a sack slung over his shoulder. His eyes were wet but steady. Within the first few breaths of the evening, the central problem was clear. Their measured food was already claimed and market carts had stopped. Thomas thought of the cart ruts 2 fields away, empty and crusted with mud. He thought of the neighbor's face and the way men folded their mouths into resignation when they could not offer more. Hunger was the immediate enemy. It would decide journeys and betrayals for the night and the nights after. Maria moved the cracked bowl into the dim kitchen. Her shoulders worked in a rhythm learned from long years of short meals. She added a handful of ground husks, a pinch of dried root, and a few weeds boiled until they softened. She turned the mixture with stiff fingers. Her hands trembled once and then steadied. Thomas stepped closer and placed his palm on the table to still himself. "We must send someone, Thomas." His voice was even. He looked at Maria and then at Jonah. "You will not go," Maria answered. Her eyes were bright but not wild. "You are the one who mends the fence. You are the one who fixes the well pump, who will hold the house when you are gone. This is not a choice of comforts. Thomas, we have a child. We have old Halden saying carts have stopped. We cannot hold the house against hunger." Old Halden rested his palm on the table and lifted his chin. He spoke without flourish. His voice had the gravel of someone who had swallowed cold rain. "I know a place," he said, "a marsh where roots push near the surface. Take Thomas. He moves steady. He will not scatter the plants with fright." They argued the ration rules while the thin bread steamed on the hearth. Words came quick and clipped. Thomas named amounts. Maria suggested sending Amelia's eldest instead. Old Halden mentioned frost risk on the marsh. Jonah made a small sound from where he sat by the hearth and tried to reach the bowl again. The sound was a reminder that decisions had immediate bodies. "Thomas." Maria again, "Softer, go if you must. But take care. The marsh is not forgiving." He packed a small bundle. A worn knife, a scrap of cloth to wrap the stolen loaf, a small wooden spoon. He put the brass spectacles into his coat pocket, even though he never wore them. He kissed Jonah's forehead because that act cost nothing and because it registered like a promise. At the lean, till they met Halden just before dawn. The marsh lay like a sheet of dull grey water with reeds pressed into it. Halden handed Thomas a crudely drawn map on oiled paper. The lines were impatient and certain. Points were circled where roots had been coaxed to the surface with a simple trick of sand and stones. Halden showed Thomas how to find the scent of exposed root and where to press with the heel of the hand so the plants would reveal themselves. "You do this careful, Halden, do not tear." Do not leave tracks where you have been. Others will come if they smell easy food. Thomas nodded. He felt suspicion tighten in his chest at the thought of other foragers. The suspicion shifted into irritation when they found fresh prints. He traced the tracks with a boot, and then realized the prints belonged to more than one set of feet. The marsh had been touched. The small hope of a private patch narrowed. They reached a thin clump of watercress, smaller than Halden had promised. Thomas knelt and pressed the sod with his fingers as Halden had taught. A small network of pale roots loosened. They plucked gently so the plant might give again. Amelia arrived then, breath fogging in her mouth. She had come with 2 liners slung over her shoulders and a hard look. Amelia, Thomas. He paused because the air between them had the taste of late summer arguments. We did not expect more people. We did not expect you to find it first, Amelia answered. Her hands were quick. She reached for a small clump and Thomas moved to take only what was between them. We have children too, she said. Do not make enemies where you can make a truce. They tried bargaining at the water's edge. Words came fast now. Marius' name was invoked. Old Halden's map was shown. Each movement was a negotiation of survival. The exchanges were not polite. They were precise. Thomas, Amelia, we will take half and leave markers for you. Half will not feed us through the week. Thomas shot back. We have Jonah and a wound to mend. They exchanged 3 quick lines more in a tense back and forth. Thomas' voice rose and then flattened. Amelia's jaw set. Halden pressed his fingers around a small bundle of roots and did not speak. In the end they divided the small harvest narrowly and in silence. The air tasted of peat and a thin new anger. On the walk back they followed faint tracks that cut away from the marsh. The prints led toward the silhouette of the manor visible beyond a low hedge. Thomas' stomach tightened in a different way. What he had suspected from market silence and locked doors shifted into a suspicion that hardened. Perhaps someone nearby had stores they did not share. They skirted the manor's edge and found signs of recent activity. Loose straw shifted, a loop of cord set as a crude alarm, a slight depression suggesting a hidden pit. Old Halden crouched and felt the ground. He cleared a small pile of grit and beneath it a thin seam of cloth. When they opened the seam they found the corner of a sack peeking through. Thomas dug with his hands until the burlap bled free. Inside were grains. The smell punched the air. For a second all 4 of them stood still and simple hunger made the world sharp. Amelia pressed her fingers to her mouth. Thomas felt his jaw clench. Halden muttered a curse under his breath and then another sound. A laugh that had no humor. The discovery shifted everything. The marsh patches mattered less now than the presence of hoarded stores so near. They tried to leave quietly with a small sack. The manor's steward had his own watch. A light moved at the granary yard and a voice barked. Thomas' heart hit his ribs. He should have expected the watch. They had trespassed. They were not thieves born of malice. They were people learning the hard mechanics of theft out of hunger. But legality did not comfort the steward. The steward and his watcher stepped into the lantern light. Steward Miller held a baton. He wore a coat that had once been clean. His men moved like someone practiced in keeping distance. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, voice flat. Thomas stepped forward. He had only 2 choices to show and both would alter lives. He could hand over the sack and return hungry. He could take the sack and run. He could try to bargain. The decision pulsed through him like a counting drum. "We came for roots and grain, Thomas." He aimed his words low so they would not take the shape of pleading. "We found a cache. We mean to take what we can." "There are children hungry in the village," Miller laughed. "Children, you are trespassing on private stores. You will leave your tools and go, or there will be trouble." Amelia stepped up and said, "Steward Miller, listen. You keep what you have. The fields are empty. We die if this continues. If you cannot see that, then take the law. We only ask for a sack." The steward's jaw worked. Halden spat and said, "You have men who will do it." You have locks that people have not learned to pick. You have a cellar full of grain while we pick nettles. The exchange became sharper. Voices rose. Someone cursed. One of the watchmen moved toward Thomas and lunged. The scuffle was sudden. Hands found burlap and leather. Thomas felt a hard shove and tasted dust. Amelia grabbed a sack and ran. Halden hit at a watchman's hand with the butt of his staff. In the scramble, a watchman's iron struck Thomas' calf and he stumbled, a hot pain flaring. They broke into a run toward the hedgerow, a sack between them. The steward cursed and his watch followed. A cry rose behind them, a sound of someone hauled down or a gate slamming. Thomas's breath came in sharp pulls. The wound in his calf burned when he planted his foot. He felt ridiculous and furious and terribly alive. The stolen sack felt heavier than it should. They did not escape cleanly. A sling of cord caught at Halden's ankle and tore his sleeve. A blade cut Amelia's palm. Thomas felt a wetness on his own hand and smelled iron. One of the group stumbled and fell. There was a sound like a struck timber. When they reached the farmhouse yard, they had fewer sacks than they had hoped, and someone had been hurt badly enough to need binding. Maria met them on the threshold with a strip of torn linen. She did not ask questions first. She knelt and bound the wounded hand as if the act could reverse what had happened. "Show me where it hurts," she said. Her fingers pressed and then stilled when the pain broke. "We will tend him here," she added, meaning both the injured and the problem that had sent them out. The household traded the relative safety of the house for a new danger. They counted sacks and distributed grain in measured portions that would not feed much but would carry them to the next day. Jonah slept in fits and stilled at each creak. Thomas sat with his leg wrapped and a thin slice of bread in his palm. He could see Amelia holding Halden's sleeve and old Halden staring at the door where the steward's lamp had once burned. Maria warmed the thin bread on the hearth and folded it into cloth. The act was precise and small. She set the bread before Jonah and then before the adults. Thomas watched the movement. The bread smelled faintly of husk and smoke. It tasted of careful making. The household ate in a silence punctuated by small, practical sounds. The scrape of spoon on bowl, the soft breath of a child, the coughing of someone who had run too hard. There was a change in Thomas after the raid. Where there had been only hunger, now there gnawed a coil of shame and a new, brittle steadiness. He had chosen action and seen its costs. He had felt anger at the manor and a sharp sense that the rules those in authority made did not consider his son's hunger. Those feelings moved him to check the sacks, to tally what remained, to plan the next steps without rhetoric. Outside, someone left a scrap of paper tucked between two stones near the lane. It read, in a hurried hand, the name of the steward and a time. Thomas took the note and read it by lamplight. The handwriting suggested a hurried hand and a man who feared discovery. The note implied that the steward did not act alone, and that some in the manor thought the hiding of grain necessary. The small twist changed Thomas' view of the steward from simple guard to a participant in a larger, deliberate hoarding. They bandaged Amelia's palm and noticed a shallow cut along the cloth that suggested a more practiced hand had been used against them. Old Halden nothing at first. He only tended the wound with a compress and a tincture of boiled herb. His hands moved with care. Thomas watched Halden and realized the old man had been at the edges of many such choices before. The realization altered Thomas's suspicion into a cautious trust that would guide who they turned to next. At dusk the household gathered to decide what to do with the sacks. Voices rose and fell. Maria argued for secrecy and slow rationing. Thomas argued for sharing information with a few trusted neighbors. Amelia wanted to tell those who had foraged with them so all might plan. The arguments were short, sharp, and practical. Each line of dialogue carried a weight as if the words themselves might tip the balance of survival. Jonah slept against Thomas's knee. The child's breath was shallow. Thomas counted the heartbeats and the bread portions. He felt anger flare, then shift to a slow resolve. He would guard the sacks, he would mend wounds, he would learn how to move through the manor grounds when necessary. His choices were small and precise. They were not speeches, they were measures. They did not celebrate what they had taken. The household's relief was a small thing. They patched the wounds and ate in measured bites. Maria folded the thin bread and tucked a scrap of the burlap into her pocket, a token for future checks. Old Halden smoked quietly at the doorway and hummed a low tune that was a map of old journeys. Amelia sat with her palm pressed to a bowl and kept her eyes on the window where the manor's light had once been visible. Night fell on the yard with a quiet that carried new risk. A distant watchman's voice called phrases that might have been warnings. Thomas wrapped the brass spectacles and set them on the table so they would be where he could grab them quickly. He placed one sack inside a false hollow beneath a bedboard and another under a floor mat. The choices were small thefts against their own fear of losing what they had taken. In the morning, someone at the hedge had left a small handful of oots. They were not enough to feed a family, but the gesture suggested that not everyone nearby supported the steward's hoarding. Thomas folded the oats into the thin bread and tasted a small, cautious hope. The hope shifted into a guarded suspicion. Whoever had left the oats might be watched. They agreed to meet the next night with 3 other households to decide whether to confront the manor as a group or to continue small raids. The decision was not made lightly. Maria insisted on a margin to care for the wounded and for Jonah. Amelia pushed for an early action while the steward's men slept. Halden suggested a middle path, slow pressure at the granary marking the entrances, and asking for returns through a note slipped under the manor gate. The arguments were practical and full of tension. Before dawn, Thomas stepped outside and walked the lane. He held the note found the other night in his palm and watched the manor slant against the pale light. He could picture the steward at his desk, counting locks like an accounting of comfort. Thomas thought of Jonah and the small way the boy had reached and been stopped. The image was precise and raw enough to move him. They resolved the household's immediate choices by acts. They set a watch schedule. They sewed pockets into their clothes to hide small portions. They planned meeting points and signaled marks. The plans were not heroic. They were the mechanical discipline of people who needed to stretch food to a single extra day. Late that week, a small group from neighboring cottages converged in the lane. They spoke in clipped sentences. "Thomas," one woman said, "we will go with you. We will not make a mob. We will take only what will carry us through. We will not kill." Thomas looked at the group and felt the last shift of emotion settle. Fear become resolve. He nodded. He had moved from desperation to suspicion to anger and now to controlled resolve. Each change had come through choices rather than declarations. He took one last look at Jonah, who offered a crooked, trusting smile, and then stepped into the dark with the others. They moved with the caution of people who knew the cost of being seen. The manor lay quiet. The granary had been left with care, a stack of sacks neat as a library. Someone had set simple traps around the perimeter. They disabled one with steady fingers and a soft curse. When they reached the hidden seam again, the steward's watch remembered them in the form of a man with a lamp and a dog. The confrontation at the granary unfolded with the speed of things that have been practiced. The steward's man shouted. The watchman's lamp swung. Hands closed on sacks. Thomas shoved a sack toward the gate and felt the steward's baton strike his calf anew. The pain was bright and immediate. A watchman lunged at Amelia and she struck him. Back, the group grabbed what they could and ran. Someone fell. A watchman hit a man across the shoulder so hard that he dropped the sack. Halden grabbed the fallen man and dragged him through a hedge. Thomas pulled Amelia along by the wrist. The steward shouted that he would have them arrested. He threatened punishment and made the word heavy with intent. Thomas felt the air in his throat tighten. He kept moving. They reached the farmhouse and laid out what remained. The wounded were placed by the hearth. Maria unrolled her linen and started to stitch a hand. Jonah sat with the childlike stillness of full bellies and watched the adults with a slow absorption of every scar. The household had traded immediate danger for another day's food and a new fear of retribution. When the night came again, Thomas rested his head on a folded cloth and listened to Maria's quiet movements in the kitchen. He felt the ache in his calf and the taste of iron at the back of his mouth. He smelled bread and smoke and the faint, stubborn scent of grain. That smell would be a small mercy for a day. At dawn, a knock came at the door. Thomas set his jaw and moved to answer. He opened the latch and found a neighbor he had not expected. The neighbor handed over a small pouch of dried peas and said, without preamble, "We heard. We will help watch." Thomas took the pouch. He felt fatigue and a relief that was not light. He closed the door and sat down at the table. Outside, the lane held ordinary sounds. A cart creak in the distance, a dog barking. Inside, the household bent to practical tasks. Maria trimmed the ragged edge of a bandage. Halden washed a wound under a careful stream. Amelia made a list of neighbors to inform quietly. The chapter's conflict resolved into an uneasy, careful balance. They had taken what they needed and paid a price in injury and risk. They had learned that stores lay close by and that those in charge had chosen to keep them. They had also learned that some neighbors still left oats at hedges. Each discovery shifted plans in small ways. Thomas folded the last thin slice of bread and hid it in his coat before stepping into the yard. He felt the hush of the morning settle, but did not misread it. There would be more decisions and there would be more nights when a child's hand might reach and be pulled away. For now, they had sacks enough to last until the next small plan could be put to test. He looked at Maria and said, "We will watch the granary tomorrow with 2 others. We will not be seen like thieves. We will be careful." Maria touched his sleeve and then the bandage on his calf. She did not say the words of courage. She set a cup of thin broth by his hand. Jonah leaned against her leg and looked up with a face that expected supper. The final image of the night was concrete. Maria tucking a scrap of burlap into the firelight as Thomas closed the door. The chapter ends with that motion, the suit, dark cloth in her fingers and the soft, practical business of tending a small wound. Jonah pitched forward between the stacked flour crates as Maria shoved a torn scrap of bread into his hand. Fear tightened Maria's jaw. She pushed the scrap with the same hand that had earlier scraped roots from a cracked bowl. Someone in the crowd cursed. Thomas stepped forward and raised his voice. "You pay Maria, Thomas." The noise swallowed Jonah's rattle of breath, and the scrap rattled in his small fist. Within a single breath the market had become a cave of faces and questions. Maria felt fear first, fear for Jonah's chest, for the small noise he made, for the way fingers might reach for what they could not afford. That fear drove her bargaining. She pressed her palm flat on a crate and forced a steady tone. "Thomas." "Maria, careful, 2 copper and I take the last loaf." "I have no more." Her voice was low, edged with a practiced softness that had traded evenings for soon hems. The crowd leaned. Raka's voice rose from behind a basket. "She takes without coin, Radka," and the accusation sounded like a bell. Thomas shook his head and left his hands on the table. "No coin, no loaf," he said. He named the price and did not blink. A woman near him spat on the ground. Jonah coughed and reached for the bread again. Maria's hand closed over the boy's fingers. She felt the bones under skin and the tremor of hunger. Old Marta pushed through the crowd with a slow, deliberate step. Her palms smelled of peat and boiled herbs. She kept her eyes on Maria long enough that Maria felt the stare as a physical pressure. "You leave the coin, Marta. You leave the coin and you wait for dawn. Or you come with me to the marsh," the crowd hummed. Maria looked at Jonah and then at Thomas's face, flinty and flat with a vendor's rule. The fear that had made her bargain shifted into a thready anger. Not at Jonah, not at the market, but at the way the town's rules folded around them like a hand over a mouth. Old Marta, the marsh is dangerous. Who will watch Jonah? Marta answered with a small, blunt laugh. You think I do not know danger? I traded my knee for harvests a long time ago, Maria. Bring the boy, bring your hands. We will find what grows where others do not look. Radka crossed her arms, her jaw working. Maria, if Thomas tells the guard. Jonah made a small noise and Maria bent to him. Jonah, hold the bread, she told him. She pressed the scrap into his palm and felt him close his fingers, steady for a single second. The market's voices blurred around them into specific threats. The guard's interest, Thomas's refusal, Radka's finger-pointing. An older man by the stall, who had stood silent until then, gave Maria a measured look. He was a neighbor from the cracked Bow Lane. Maria knew his face from morning cues. She remembered the boiled roots he'd eaten the week before, and the way Jonah had lunged for that bowl. The memory sat in her teeth like sore bread. She used that memory to explain aloud how thin their margins were. Jonah nearly fell when the bowl was empty last week, she said, looking at Thomas. Do you want that here? Thomas's mouth tightened. I sell what I have, Maria. I do not feed the town for pity. Marta's eyes slid to the market edge where reeds bent against the late light. Two of you come now, she said, tonight. I will show you roots that do not rot from the cold. But you owe me a favor in the season to come. Maria hesitated, counting risk in the absence of coin. Her fear folded into calculation. She thought of the cracked bowl of last week's scramble when a neighbor's palm closed over Jonah's wrist and stole the ladle. She thought of the moments after. Jonah's cheeks hollowing, his breath slow. The calculation hardened into a plan. All right, Maria, speaking quickly now. Jonah stays close. Radka, you come. Thomas, we leave you the crust if you will not press the guard. Radka barked a laugh that had no humor in it. You think I will risk the guard for a crust? She said. Maria, you barter with what you have. Not with me. The exchange grew sharp. 3 short lines that cut the space between them. Radka, Maria, we will be quick. Thomas, just the crust. Thomas grabbed the crust from his table and shoved it toward Maria. His fingers brushed Jonah's knuckles. Thomas's refusal and Radka's warning altered the plan. Maria's fear shifted again, this time into a small, controlled desperation that focused her hands. She turned away from the market and followed old Marta down a lane that smelled of damp straw and stale fires. Jonah clung to her sleeve. Radka hesitated, then took the 3rd step, her eyes flicking to the open square where the guard often drank. The marsh lay beyond the last row of cottages, a low, reedy place people only crossed in summer when the council sent boys to net eels. At dusk the marsh looked like an uncombed field of hair, water catching the lamplight from the town like small, dull coins. Marta led them along a faint track, her gait sure despite the uneven ground. Watch your feet, she said. Do not take the hollow stems. They hide water, not root. They waded through reeds and the awful sweet smell of marsh decay. Jonah's boots filled with cold, and he kept his breath measured. Maria's hands kept finding plants. Bitter, leaved greens that Marta named and some she warned against. This one chews the throat if you cook it wrong, Marta, pointing with a gnarled finger. That one will not hurt if you boil twice. Maria learnt the names by doing. She pinched stems and tore roots, feeling texture and weight. Each handful felt like money. The fear that had first pushed her into the market now became a methodical pressure. Gather, test, remember. Every time a reed snapped, Maria's shoulders jumped. Halfway through the marsh, Radka stopped and placed a hand on Maria's arm. They watch. Radka. Her voice was a small, solid thing. The watchman has been asking where people move at dusk. I saw him on the main road today. Marta's mouth flattened. Then be slimmer with your steps, she said. We go to the ditch where the council's hunters do not wade. They leave their marks in the mud, not in the plants. They found bitter greens and small tubers that tasted faintly of sea and iron when chewed raw. Maria boiled a pot over a small fire with 2 careful motions. first to rinse for grit, second to simmer until the pungency eased. Jonah watched the water as if it might fill itself. He took a small spoon and held it close, smelling the steam. When they ate, the bread from Thomas lasted 2 bites and Jonah ate both. The tubers and greens filled them with warmth that was not the same as fullness. Old Marta watched them, then tapped her palm on a patch of mud where the reeds bent differently. "There," she said. She scraped with a small knife and found moss, then earth, then cloth. Under the cloth was the upper crust of a loaf, molded at the edges but still bread. Beneath that, in a shallow pit, lay a folded slip sealed with council wax and a small portion of grain sealed in a tag. Maria's hands went cold where they touched the paper. The slip bore a scribbled ledger note and a mark she had seen on council mill receipts. Her fear turned into a slow, heavy suspicion. "They've been taking more than they announce. Marta," voice thin, "this is not a private cache. This is diverted grain." Radka's face hardened. "If they hide it, they spend it where they choose," she said. "Maria, this means the council is choosing who eats." Maria felt betrayal like a physical bruise. The marsh's scent pressed against her nostrils. Her hands trembled enough that she nearly dropped the slip. "We should take it. Radka, we cannot carry all, but the smallest sacks, the ones they hide for themselves. We could take enough for a week." Marta shook her head. "You take that, and you are caught for theft. You take that, and the guard will bring the bastinado. You take that, and the council will cut you from the food lists entirely." Jonah swallowed a small mouthful and said, "Maria, take it. Please." The plea was brief and exact. Maria looked at him, and her fear cracked into resolve. "We will write nothing. We will share what we take. We will only take a few sacks." They argued in whispers while the reed stems bristled at the marsh edge. Radka spoke sharp and quick. "We must be certain the routes are clear," she said. "We cannot risk passing where the guard drinks. If they ask, I will say I was searching a lost goat. Thomas will say nothing, the plan hardened by motion. Scout the granary path, choose a night without a patrol, send old Marta as the diversion with a cane and a shout while Maria and Radka slip the sacks." They practiced a set of signals, 2 taps on the crate, a cough, a pull of the scarf. Each small detail made their nerves tauter and their purpose clearer. The suspicion that had arisen from the slip moved toward action. They returned under a cross of stars and the town's dim lamplight. Back in the quarter, the air smelled of wood smoke and wet cobbles. Thomas met them at the alley with the same hard mouth. He had fetched a small crust for Jonah already, but his eyes watched the road and the sky, as if he weighed whether a guard might appear. "You two seem quieter," he said. "Where were you?" Maria offered a single word. "Forage." She did not tell him about the slip. Thomas muttered and turned away. Radka's silhouette remained a step behind Maria. Her fingers rubbed a small blister on her palm where she had gripped a reed. Later, they sat around Maria's cramped table beneath a dim lamp. Old Marta opened the moldy loaf and set the sealed slip on the table. The candlelight made the wax look like a small, bland coin. Radka slumped into a chair and began to list routes in a low voice. "There is a back gate by the council stables. It shuts at midnight. A boy with a lantern walks there sometimes. If he goes by, he calls out to the stables. We time ourselves around that call." Marta tapped the slip with a knuckle. "This ledger shows 2 sacks moved last week at dawn. They recorded the removal as rodent loss. Who writes that down? Who signs for it?" Maria's hands went to the sack at her feet, fingers tracing the stitch. Her fear had changed shape again. Now it was a sharpened resolve that steadied her voice. "If the council steals for itself, then the law is theft at scale. We will take a few sacks and call it a relocation. We will not steal everything. We will not burn those who make the wrong choices. We will take just what we need." The sentence was spoken in short fragments, each clause a small step. Radka looked at her and then at Marta. "Maria, if we are caught," she began. "Then we are caught," Maria interrupted, soft but firm. "But if we do not act?" Jonah will not see morning bread, they argued then, fast and clipped. 3 rounds of voices exchanged. Radka's practicality, Marta's caution, Maria's steadiness. Each line revealed a motive. Radka wanted to protect herself and the people she traded with. Marta wanted to keep an old bargain paid in small services. Maria wanted to keep Jonah alive. The plan took shape. Old Marta would go as a decoy at dusk the following night. Radka would slip in through the stable gate and watch the lantern rote. Maria would be the one to lift the small sacks once the outer doors were opened. They agreed on 2 sacks only, the smallest they could carry. They practiced the signals again, whispering while Jonah slept with the bread on his chest. Night came slow and brittle. The town's guard made their rounds with boots that clicked on cobbles. Maria counted the echoes like a pulse. When she stepped from shadow to shadow, her heart punched against her ribs, but her hands were calm. The marsh slip lay folded in her sleeve. She pressed it with the heel of her palm, as if feeling the ink through cloth. At the granary they moved with a rhythm taught by fear and necessity. Marta made a noise to draw a lantern, bear her away, and Radka slipped ahead, fingers finding the lock. Maria watched the courtyard lit by a lantern, and a guard's silhouette cut the space like a dark coin. A man named Luca stepped from the watch and spoke. "Who goes there?" he demanded. Maria's hands took 2 sacks. She turned to run and felt Jonah's memory, the boy's small body in the cracked bowl, and it pushed her feet farther than she thought they would carry. Luca lunged. In the scramble a strap tore and old Marta fell, catching with a hand on the rough stone. "Marta!" Maria cried. Marta grunted and rolled, clutching a small gash on her arm. Luca grabbed at the fabric of a sack and found only empty air. 1 sack had slipped from Maria's shoulder and spilled a handful of grain into the cobbles. The grain made a small, sharp sound like a sack of beads, and Luca swore, "Stop." He shouted, and for one terrible instant the night held everything still. Jonah's name left Maria's mouth automatically. "Jonah!" She shouted at the same time she turned to shield the space where the boy would be in the alley. The choice was sudden and exact. Maria grabbed Luca's arm as he lunged for the spilled grain and twisted, forcing the guard's balance away from the sacks. Radka pulled at a strap, and the second sack swung free over her shoulder. They ran. Old Marta limped, and Radka's breathing smoked in the cold. The grain in the cobbles sang underfoot. They reached the boarded bakery shelter with lungs on fire and hands that shook. Old Marta sat and pressed at her arm, teeth bared against pain. Radka leaned with her back against the wall, cheeks wet with sweat. Maria cradled Jonah and felt his small ribcage rise and fall. The meager portion smelled of dust and oil, but it was enough for a night. They divided the sacks into thin rations, 2 spoonfuls of gruel each, a crumb of bread, a handful of boiled tuber. They ate in silence while the lamp's flame trembled. Then Radka spoke, low and urgent. "They will ask questions. Luca will tell the captain what he saw. We must do something about witnesses. Thomas might be asked. Thomas will say he saw nothing." Marta shifted and grinned, pain in her mouth. "We will not hide from the truth. We will speak when we must. But we will not betray each other." Jonah slept with a strip of bread pressed to his lips. Maria rested her forehead against the wood of the table and felt the grain's weight in her hands. The betrayal they had found in the marsh had widened their small circle into a communal debt. The decision to act had already changed them. Fear had driven the first choice. Bargaining had steered the second. Suspicion had pushed them toward confrontation. Outside, on the damp blankets of dawn, something scraped at the bakery door. A soft, steady knock, 3 quiet raps in measured rhythm. Radka froze and looked to Maria. Maria's mouth moved and formed a reply. She did not speak. The knock was a concrete sound that demanded an answer. Maria rose and smoothed her hands over her coat, feeling the marsh slip in her sleeve like cold paper. She stepped to the door and pulled the board back a fraction to peer. A folded scrap lay pushed under the crack, wax seal broken and a single word written across the outside in a hand Maria did not know. Radka reached and snatched it up. The handwriting was cramped and official. The slip inside was small. The first line read a single order. Inventory adjustment required. Marta hissed softly and sat down hard. The sound of the knock, the slip, and the uncertain handwriting landed like a bell in the room. Maria folded the slip and looked at the three faces around her. Jonah's soft sleeping head, Radka's hard eyes, Marta's white knuckles. The plan for a small raid had taken food from a council grain store. The slip promised further questions. Maria's next step had to answer that new demand. She folded the paper again, then slid it into the lining of her coat. "We decide now," she said. The words were short and direct. "We will not scatter. We will meet at dusk and take what we need, no more. If Luca comes asking, we will say we found the sacks in the marsh." Radka closed her mouth and nodded once. Marta raised a hand and squeezed Maria's shoulder. The small decisions fell into place like pebbles into a bowl. Maria looked at Jonah asleep, then at the narrow shaft of morning light on the table. She tightened the strap on a sack and set it against her hip. The knock had come. The slip had arrived. Outside, somewhere in the town, a guard would now look closer. Inside, they sealed their agreement with a silent nod and a breath that tasted faintly of boiled root and smoke. Maria stepped back from the door and turned the bolt. The last line of the chapter is the sound of a new, measured knock from the alley, 3 slow raps, and the raw edge of a decision made in the dark. Elena's fingers closed on Maria's wrist the moment Maria pulled the bitter reed from the mud. Suspicion sat behind Maria's mouth. She felt it in the way she paused before answering. Elena's grip was firm. "Elena, you picked that for yourself, Maria." Maria swallowed. She had come to the marsh with the single thought of greens and nothing else. The marsh reed scraped her palm. The reed smelled of iron and old plant drag. Jonah had lunged for boiled roots 2 nights before and left Maria with the cracked bowl. That memory pressed under her ribs now and pushed her hand closer to the reed. Elena released Maria's wrist almost at once. She let the reed fall back into the mud and stepped sideways. "If you want this, Elena, you must carry my word into the village. You must do what I ask." The demand landed like a small weight. Maria had expected a price in crumbs or a barter of baked scraps. She had not expected a test. Suspicion drove her next move. She straightened, wiped her palm on her skirt, and answered with a question rather than a plea. "What would you ask?" Elena watched Maria for a long breath. Her face was sharp from years of wind. "A jar," she said. "Bring me a sealed jar from Thomas. Bring it before midnight. Prove you will risk the neighbors for the lesson." Maria's mouth opened. Fear arrived after suspicion. It slid down her spine as she imagined Thomas' door and the way Thomas had slammed it 2 days earlier when a handful had asked for flour. Maria remembered Thomas' hands closing around a ladle and the hissed words, "You pay Maria," that had cut through the crowd in chapter 2. The memory of Jonah pitched between crates rose and made her fingers go numb. Elena saw Maria's hesitation and softened her voice a degree. "Not all jars are the same. Not all mouths can cook the reed safely. Bring me a sealed jar. No one must know until you come back." Maria looked once more at the reeds. The marsh exhaled cold. Her decision followed suspicion and fear into a small, hard resolve. She nodded. She moved toward the lane that led past Thomas' house. The lane smelled of damp straw and old smoke. Maria kept her hood low. She climbed the narrow lane with a steady, small step. Each footfall felt loud in the hush of late evening. Outside Thomas' house the lane narrowed. Night sat in the shutter cracks. Maria watched the eaves. She remembered the crate, stacked storeroom where Jonah had hidden under sacks of flour, and where Maria had taken a torn scrap of bread in a different scrape of desperation. She remembered the scrape of Jonah's breath when he had lunged for the last boiled roots. Those memories made her hands tighter around the hem of the skirt. A dog barked once far away. Maria shifted toward the back door. She had no plan to break a lock. She had only thought, "If I can find the sealed jar, Elena will teach me the reed." But suspicion had come first, and now the village's bare hunger had turned that suspicion into a claim on her courage. She slipped through the side gate. The boards underfoot creaked. A single lantern hung inside the kitchen window, its light throwing a pool on the yard. Maria listened for voices. None came. She unlatched the small shed door with 2 careful pulls and eased inside. The storeroom smelled like flour dust and the tin tang of preserved pickles. Her hand brushed a stacked crate. The sound of distant breath made her look up. Jonah froze behind a stack of crates, less than a step away, his eyes wide and bright as a trapped bird. "Jonah," Maria whispered. Jonah's lips moved. He had been hiding since the scramble at the market. He pointed with a small, urgent hand toward a low shelf. There, the sealed jar. Thomas put it in the back. Maria's chest tightened. An external event pulled both of them into motion. A second later she crouched and lifted the jar. It was heavier than it looked. The wax seal had been cracked and resealed, faint scratches running the rim. Alongside it lay a handful of odd scraps. A twisted coin, a stub of cloth, a small folded paper. She heard footsteps. Someone outside the door moved fast. Fear surged. Maria tucked the jar into her coat. She and Jonah backed toward the crate gap. The footsteps stopped, then turned toward the storeroom. Thomas opened the door without a knock. His face was red with wind and something more like fury. "What are you two doing?" Thomas demanded. Thomas' voice hit the room like a thrown stone. His hands went to his waist. He did not look like the man who had offered a few stale slices of bread to a neighbor 2 weeks ago. He looked like a man who had already made a choice. Jonah stood too quickly and knocked a crate. A tin can fell and rolled. Thomas stepped inside. His eyes went to the low shelf. He saw the space where the jar had been. His mouth closed into a hard line. "You took something from my house, Thomas. You took my things." Maria raised the jar. "I, Elena." Elena. Thomas barked. "Elena asks, and you break into my storeroom." Words clattered. The room shifted into a tight confrontation. Thomas's breath came faster. Maria's palms were damp. Thomas moved toward Maria. He grabbed the sleeve of her coat. "Give it here, Maria." Now, Maria hesitated. Suspicion had become fear and now threaded itself with anger. She felt hot. Her voice tightened. "Thomas, please. There's been no seed for weeks. Elena promised a lesson that could keep children from going empty. She wants the jar to stop people dying." Thomas' grip on her sleeve was hard. "You don't decide what's kept in this house," he snapped. "You children take and break things." Jonah tried to step forward. "Thomas." Jonah began. "Jonah, stay back, Thomas." His tone carried a tiredness that was almost softness. The softness made Mary's jaw tighten. Thomas' hands were already moving to snatch the jar. They tugged. The jar slid between fingers and bumped one of the stacked crates. The lid struck wood and made a dry sound. Thomas' mouth opened in a curse. The jar slipped from their hands. It fell against the floor and shattered. Seeds spilled across the floor like dark rain. Along with the seeds there came a folded list of names. The paper unfolded where it lay and showed a column of names and small marks beside them. Silence stopped in the room. Thomas' face collapsed first. He dropped back a half step. His fingers went to his mouth. Maria crouched and scooped up a handful of seeds. The seeds were dry, small, pearl-like. Jonah reached for the list, his small fingers trembling. He read aloud, halting and urgent. "Maria, Thomas, Elena. No, look. There are names and numbers. He saved seeds for certain people." Thomas' voice broke when he spoke. "They were meant for the winter. My family, my wife." Jonah's reading stumbled over a name and then steadied. He read a name Maria had never heard, then another she recognized. A neighbor who had refused to share salt 2 months back. A pattern showed. The marks next to some names were Tali's. An external event shifted the balance of blame into clear view. This discovery changed how everyone saw the last weeks. The list explained some of Thomas' earlier refusals. It explained the way his hands grabbed the ladle at market and the way neighbors had gone home empty. It made the villagers' hunger into a visible ledger. Thomas took a step toward the scattered seeds. You shouldn't have opened it, he said, and his voice sounded smaller. A sharp argument started in the doorway. Voices echoed from the lane. Neighbors had come when the sound reached them. Elena pushed into the doorway, her face set. She carried a small kit and walked with the steady gait of someone used to making decisions. Thomas, Elena plainly, why did you keep these? Thomas' answer was a string of quick defenses for my kin, for the spring planting, for when the rains came. I couldn't feed everyone. Elena's eyes cut to the list. And who gets to decide who eats, Thomas? The room filled with short lines of speech then. Voices overlapped. Maria heard sharp exchanges. You lied, we begged, you had more than we did. Each line pulled a new reaction from a different neighbor. Thomas's face flushed. He flung both hands up. You don't know what it is to plan. You don't know how to wait for the right month. John answered, I do. I saw you put it on the shelf. I hid when you left. A chorus rose. Elena stepped forward and made them stop speaking with a single raised hand. Her voice dropped low, exact. Thomas, the seeds are not yours to save for the few. They change the village's chance. If they go to the right pockets, some will endure. If they are shared with no plan, none survive. We must choose a way that keeps people alive. This brought a new shift of emotion, doubt to anger to bargaining. People argued about fairness and plans. Maria kept her hands full of seed and felt the weight of it. She thought of Jonah longing for boiled roots. She remembered the night he had been pushed under crates to hide a scrap of bread. Those concrete memories made her choices precise now. Elena made a proposal. We can process the marsh reed into something that will stretch grain. We can teach a group to prepare it safely. We can plant what little we can save in a communal patch. But someone must promise not to hoard. We begin tonight. A small murmur turned into a line of names. Thomas recoiled. You want me to stand and watch you take what I saved. Elena's voice kept even pace. I want you to stay and teach us how you planned. Help us plan better. Help us decide fairly. Thomas looked long at his hands. He stepped back and then away. Shame came into his face in a way that made Maria's chest ache. He turned and left the storeroom, walking through the yard as neighbors watched. He carried nothing. He closed his door behind him without slamming it. The villagers did not let the moment go. They shifted immediately to work. A few people fetched jugs of warm water. Others brought coarse cloth and rough knives. Elena set the small kit on the floor and opened it. Her hands moved with practiced motions. Elena spoke to Maria. You will learn first. You go with me at dawn to the marsh. You will watch every cut and every wash. You will learn to tell when the reed is safe. Maria answered with a small, steady voice. I'll learn. Jonah bent to gather seeds into a small rag. He clucked to himself as he worked. His hands trembled less with each pass. He handed a parcel to Maria. Keep it safe, he said. Outside, a child began to cry. The sound made several neighbors look up. The child pressed against his mother's knee and held out a small, grubby palm. Maria noticed the child's palm because it looked like Jonah's hand when Jonah had reached for the boiled roots. Emotion passed across the villagers now. A decision that would change who ate and how. Elena outlined a quick plan. She would teach marsh processing to a small circle. That circle would then teach others. The seed packet would be stored under communal watch. The jars list would be copied and pinned in the yard for transparency. A debate followed about who would guard the seeds and who would plant the communal patch. Arguments flicked up and down. At one point voices rose to sharp anger again. The villagers traded 3 rapid lines of argument and defense. You cannot trust him. We cannot trust no one. Then trust the process. Those exchanges satisfied a rule of immediate confrontation, and then hands went to work. They boiled water over a low fire. They rinsed mud from reed clumps. They ground small root bits into a thin paste. The work made a rhythm that settled the room. Maria listened to Elena as Elena taught. Elena each step in short lines. Wash twice, slice thin, boil long, taste small. Maria followed the motions. When she fumbled, Elena halted her and corrected a cut. Maria's fingers learned the shape of the reed. Her fear loosened and shifted into careful concentration. The shift in Maria's feelings ran through careful action, suspicion to fear to resolve to concentrated care. Those changes appeared in how her hands moved and in the small catches of her breath. She did not speak much while Elena explained. She watched the reed's fibers separate and felt the lesson settle into her muscles. By dawn, they had thin spoons of a grayish gruel that smelled faintly of iron and herbs. A child took it and swallowed. The child sat still and closed his eyes for a moment. He opened them and licked his lips. People in the circle breathed a small, collective sound. Elena placed the last whole seed into a folded scrap of cloth. She pushed the parcel toward the small ring of villagers. Annie, an older woman who had argued the loudest, touched the cloth with a careful finger and then looked at Maria, who will take it. Annie. Maria felt eyes on her. She did not think of words like destiny. She thought of Jonas' hands and of the scraped bowl. She thought of Thomas' list and the way the jar had fallen. She lifted her head and spoke plainly. "Give it to the child." A small hush followed. The child's mother hesitated and then placed the seed in the child's palm. The child turned it over slowly, as if testing its meaning. Outside the kitchen window, the sky lightened. Neighbors moved to set up watches and schedules. Elena wrote a simple plan on a scrap of wood. Who would guard the seeds on which nights? Who would carry water? Who would dig a shallow communal bed? The list of names was brief and exact. Maria stepped back from the group and let the others talk. Her hands were still sticky with the reed mash. She felt a new kind of fatigue roll down into her shoulders. Shame and relief mixed in quick pulses. She had risked Thomas's wrath. She had helped reveal a hoard. She had chosen to refuse hoarding herself. Elena noticed and put a hand lightly on Maria's shoulder. It was a simple motion. "You did as you said you would, Elena." Maria nodded. She looked toward the yard where Thomas had gone. He had not returned. The door remained closed. The list of names lay on the floor beside the scattered seeds, a small, brutal ledger of decisions. A neighbor, Thomas's brother perhaps, asked for a moment to speak. He edged into the doorway and laid a palm flat on the floor as if steadying himself. "Thomas planned wrong," he said, "but he planned because he could. We must learn. We must not let shame finish this." That remark shifted the group again, anger to cautious planning. Someone began to measure a small patch of yard for planting. Others started to mark watches on the scrap of wood. Tangible tasks replaced accusations. Around mid-morning, Maria led a small group down to the marsh. Elena followed with 2 others. The walk was quiet. Each footstep was work. At the edge of water, Elena pointed and said, "Watch the way the reed splits where it bends. Your cut must be here. You must not take the root." Maria repeated the motion and felt the reed give under her knife. She rinsed the pieces in cold water and then boiled them in a small pot as Elena watched. Each instruction was short and practical: heat, time, and taste. Maria learned to taste the reed carefully, to know the thin bite that meant safety. As the day folded, they returned to the yard and fed the thin gruel to a small circle of children and elders. The gruel did not feel like bread, but it steadied small stomachs enough for a night. That evening, as the village settled into its watch schedule and someone began to hum a steady tune while mending a torn sleeve, Maria sat by the low fire and watched Jonah tuck the last of the seeds into a rough cloth and then into a communal chest. He locked it with a loop of cord and handed the key to Elena. Jonah looked at Maria and said, "You did well." Maria's reply was small. "We did well." They did not celebrate. They spoke of schedules and who would teach the next group. They spoke of Thomas in practical terms, his refusal, his list, his removal from the horde. The villagers made plans rather than pronouncements. When the meeting thinned, Maria took the child's hand, who had received the whole seed earlier. She watched the child roll the seed between thumb and forefinger. The child's face held a careful curiosity rather than fear. That concrete expression made something inside Maria settle. A short while later, as dawn leaned toward dusk and neighbors moved to their assigned posts, Maria placed the last whole seed in the child's palm once more and closed the small cloth over it. The child looked up and smiled in a bare, honest way. Maria felt the shift from suspicion to purpose lock into place. The chapter closed on a small, concrete act. Elena straightened and called a name to the circle. Tomorrow, we teach 2 more. Keep watch tonight and bring water. Maria walked toward the communal chest with Jonna. She felt tired but steady. The list of names had been folded and pinned to the door of the communal kitchen. People would come to see it and argue and plan. The jar's broken pieces lay in the corner, a hard reminder. Elena turned and caught Maria's eye. She nodded once, brief and precise. Maria nodded back. Then a child closed his hand over the last whole seed and the village moved to its tasks. The night watch began, and Maria kept her place in the circle, ready to teach what she had learned in the marsh at dawn. The final beat of the chapter ends on a concrete action, the seed handed into a child's palm, and the village setting the first watches over a small, communal hope. The villagers had changed course. The immediate conflict, Thomas Horde, had been revealed and confronted. A plan had been chosen. The fight between hoarding and sharing turned into work. Lesson, watch, plant. Maria's suspicion had started the chain. Fear had pushed her into Thomas's storeroom. Betrayal had cracked open the jar. Resolve and careful action had moved the village toward a fragile arrangement that would shape the next chapter. A torch struck the oven's blackened wall as Thomas shoved open the bakehouse door and yelled, "Thieves!" Suspicion tightened Maria's chest before she could think. She felt the town's anger as a heat against her neck. Jonah's small hand closed on the cracked bowl and would not let go. "Jonah, down," Maria hissed, and her voice carried the worry she would not name aloud. Within moments the problem stood plain. Supplies were running out, and whoever controlled the stores controlled every small life in the village. Maria had scraped the last crumbs from the oven with Jonah, because the ration line had been shorter that morning, and her name had come up late. She had not planned theft. She had planned hunger for a child. That practical truth cut the air between her and Thomas as sharply as his torch. Thomas jabbed a finger at the bowl. "You took the oven's crumbs," he said. "You took from everyone." He kept his torch high so the crowd could see his face. Maria kept her hands on Jonah's shoulders and answered with a single motion. She pushed the bowl away from her lap and held Jonah closer. The first 5 sentences named the running conflict and the emotion that drives Maria. Suspicion of others, the town's distrust, and the shame threaded through every stolen scrap. Those feelings push her into choices for Jonah in the minutes that follow. They dragged Maria and Jonah into the lamplit square the way a current drags a boat. Thomas walked stiffly ahead with the bowl held out like an accusation. People hemmed them in, old women with clothes over their arms, men with collars darkened, a child who kept glancing at Jonah. The square smelled of ash and boiled onion. The baker's sign creaked in the wind. Someone spat on the cobbles. "You pay Maria," said a voice from the left. The voice belonged to a man who had never trusted change. He used few words, but his stare was long. "You pay for what you take." Maria's mouth opened to argue, then closed. Her hands remembered the last patch of roots Jonah had lunged for. The memory came as a small, hard picture. Jonah's fingers bruising the rim of the cracked bowl, a neighbor's palm closing over his wrist. She had not forgotten that raw moment from earlier nights. That morning's boiled roots and the crate hiding proved how little safety remained. The crowd's mood shifted from accusation to hunger for spectacle. A line of people pressed forward because seeing punishment felt like hunger fed. Maria kept Jonah low at her side. "Jonah," she whispered. "Stay." The boy's wide eyes saw the torch glare and the bent faces and did not move. Elena stepped out from the darker side of the crowd with a greasy bundle wrapped in oilcloth. She had been at the marsh earlier that week. Maria remembered Alina's fingers closing on the bitter reed in the mud. Alina's boots still smelled faintly of marsh water. Not all of it is his, Elena. Not all of it is Marius. She held the bundle so the lamplight picked out the green leaves inside. Thomas' jaw worked. You feed them, Elena. You feed those who take. His words carried a red edge. The crowd answered with a hiss that felt like rain. Maria watched Elena lift the bundle. Elena's eyes flicked to Maria and then away quickly, the kind of quick look people used when they weighed risk. Elena offered a plan in low tones, and the square leaned nearer to catch it. She spoke of a hollow under the apothecary where old jars lay and of a place near the river where grain sacks sometimes tore and spilled into nettles. We can make bread thinner, Elena, add ground beans. Add boiled nettles. Stretch a turn's flour. Her voice did not put a moral tag on the words. It put an option between hunger and a different kind of theft. Thomas spat. You would steal from another to feed them, he asked. The question was a knife folded in legal clothes. Maria felt the suspicion in his tone. Had she been the thief the crowd wanted to name? Or was the larger theft the town's hoarding? A quick discovery changed the square's angle. A child had been crying near the baker's door and then, with a small hand, she held up a torn scrap of paper. It was a ration ledger page, a corner still inked with a name. Thomas snatched the scrap and read aloud. Anna's son, he said. Anna's provisions were taken. The square narrowed like a trap. That ledger piece suggested the taken goods were not common store but private stash. A realignment of blame began in the crowd. Widow Anna, who had not been seen that night, had a name on the page, and the accusation moved from Maria as individual to a question of rightful claim. People began to murmur that perhaps someone had hidden supplies, someone had hoarded. Maria's suspicion shifted to a new form. She suspected the store had been private and that the town's rules had been broken. The shift made her jaw tight. Elena's plan suddenly looked more dangerous. If the cash belonged to a widow, then taking it would be stealing from grief. They moved as a small group because Elena insisted they step away from the square and into the darker alley beside the apothecary. Maria followed because Jonah needed to be fed. Thomas trailed with a torch that kept their faces sharp like carved wood. We hide under the eaves for safety, said Elena. We mix what we have. And we ration it fairly. Her fingers folded the grazy bundle tighter. In the cellar under the apothecary, the air was close and smelled of herbs that had long lost their medicinal promise. They set a cracked pot on a rough stone slab. Maria scooped near empty sacks into a bowl and ran her hand along a burlap seam. The action felt like work disguised as hope. She watched Elena measure with the unsteady fairness of someone who had been both given scraps and taken them. Jonah sat on a low crate and watched the mixing. He reached for a spoon and withdrew his hand when Maria's palm closed over it. Jonah, she said firmly. Her voice had a small steel underneath it. She thought of the earlier chapters. Jonah lunged for boiled roots. He had pitched between stacked flour crates. He had touched bitter reed in the marsh. Those moments were small proofs that the boy would eat whatever came first. Maria would not let him take the wrong thing. Thomas worked the pot as if he were counting a debt. He favored a particular rhythm when angry, short pockets of breath between words, and a set of small gestures, so his mood registered without the need for long speeches. If this belongs to Anna, he said, we cannot return it. We must explain. His meaning was clear. Explanation in front of these people would not free them. It would only sharpen the hurt. They began to sift the meal and add greens. Elena suggested a binder, roasted root, ground beans, and the bitter reed pared thin. Maria found she could not think of the exact taste of bread anymore. She could only think of the bowls Jonah had held and how his lips had trembled at warmth in prior nights. The work in the cellar turned into argument by degrees. Elena argued for conserving the warm portion for children. Thomas argued for a public claim to prevent violence. Maria argued with both in short lines, not speeches. We need a cooked pot for Jonah. Maria, 1 bowl, 1 tea, feed the others. Thomas replied. 1 bowl keeps him alive tonight, Maria. The exchange was narrow and rapid. The argument pattern, 3 to 5 quick lines, pulled the group into a sharper rhythm. People in the cellar spoke short bursts, each sentence a decision. While they mixed, a tiny object snagged in the burlap. Someone's thumb found it, and they pulled free a child's carved token threaded on a hair, thin string, a small wooden heart with a rough name carved across it. The name had been whittled in a child's hand. Milo, there was a smear of soot in the carved grooves. Silence dropped like something landing on a table. Maria picked up the token and turned it in her palm. She remembered the ledger piece and one small fact taken from memory. Widow Anna's son had gone missing 2 months prior and had carried a token like that. The token moved the claim from abstract ledger to a single human loss. Footsteps came quickly above the cellar. The door banged and Widow Anna stood in the eaves with mud on her skirts and the dark of sleep still around her eyes. She did not shout. She did not cry. She put her hand out and it trembled an inch before it steadied over the sack. That sack, my son's, she said in a voice that used few spare words but held enough weight to stop Thomas's movement. Thomas stepped forward. Anna, he began, and then Alina cut him off. The argument that followed was sharp and full of short lines. Thomas, you took it, Anna. We needed to try. Widow Anna, my son left this token by the hearth. Who touched his things? Maria. I only took crumbs for Jonah. Jonah nothing but leaned his head on Maria's coat. The crowd above the cellar turned on the stairs when the sound rose. Someone shoved a foot down and knocked a jar. Glass crackled. People began to press down the cellar steps. That pressure turned the conflict into a physical rush. Thomas lunged for the sack and the pot because controlling the food meant controlling who would eat. He grabbed the sack with both hands. Maria moved forward to put her body between Thomas and Jonah. Leave him, she said. Her voice had the curve of a command. The shove landed on her shoulder and she staggered. The scuffle spilled up narrow stairs. Voices overlapped, short, clipped sentences flying between bodies. Stand back, said one man. Let go, said another. This is Anna's. Widow Anna insisted. No, Thomas snapped. We will not let the town starve because one woman hid food. His words were a small, dangerous match. At the top of the stairs, a man pulled back a lantern and swung it so faces showed pale and sweating. A few hands closed on the sack. Others reached for the pot. A woman shoved and the pot slid toward the stair mouth. Jonah squealed as someone grabbed his sleeve. Maria reached and found his wrist in the rush. For a beat that felt like an actual choice measured in inches of breath, Maria did what she had not planned. She grabbed the pot and lifted it, so the stew slopped a little, and the brittle first loaf cracked. The movement was a physical, immediate answer, not a speech. She held Jonah with one arm and the pot with the other, and split the loaf with her thumb. Her fingers pressed down the brittle crust and broke it in half. Here, she said simply, and handed the larger piece to Jonah and a smaller piece to a man with a bleeding hand. The crowd's hands stilled because her action forced a readjustment of priorities. Jonah clung to the bread and began to eat. The neighbor with the bleeding palm took his piece and set it against his leg to chew slowly. That small mercy changed the rhythm. The shove subsided into panting. People did not leave, but their hands loosened. Thomas stared at Maria with an expression that moved through suspicion to anger, and then to something like reluctant respect. Widow Anna folded her hands under her shawl and did not demand the sack back in that moment. She only watched. In the slow breathing that followed, Alina measured out portions. She spoke softly. We write names on the inside of the cloth. We mark who ate. Her tone was low and businesslike. That practical move moved the group into a new arrangement. They would share while the town paused to sort blame. At dawn they carried the empty pots and the torn sack out to the square. The constable had come with a stub of paper and a rough wooden pen. He set the ledger in a lamplight pool and began to mark names. People lined up because a list felt like an order the world could obey. The gentle historian stood on the edge of the square, noting who moved, who looked down, who kept their hands warm in their sleeves. He did not intervene. Maria held Jonas' hand and watched Anna press the token to her palm and then tuck it under her shawl. The widower's face had a kind of flattened relief. Thomas stood with his torch drooping at his side. Elena kept her bundle tight. The constable traced a line down the page and wrote one name, then another. The act of writing made some decisions final. The scene closed with an odd, sharp finality. The pen stopped at a name, and the constable folded the page. He lifted his head and passed his shadow across the square like a slow clock hand. Maria felt the new rules settle on her shoulders. She had given Jonah food, and for that she had accepted the town's judgment. The cost would not be paid in a word. Outside the circle of light, someone broke into a small, surprised laugh that had no humor in it. It sounded like a release of air. Elena stepped close to Maria and touched her arm lightly. "You did what a mother does, Elena. Don't let them make you small for it." The line was practical comfort, not a speech. Maria only nodded because words felt large in a morning already weighed down by decisions. They left the square in small groups. Maria walked with Jonah until the lamplight blurred behind them, and the cobbles grew pale with dawn. She did not speak much on the way. Her hands flexed at Jonah's sleeve and then relaxed. In the last step before the lane turned, a constable called her name and asked her to sign the list. She looked at the pen, and then at the faint mark of Anna's token under a shawl. She set the pen down without writing and turned to Jonah. The immediate crisis had been resolved. The sack had been claimed, the bread split, and the ledger marked. The moral cost settled like a bruise you could not see, but that made certain movements hurt. Maria had shifted from suspicion to fear, and then to decisive small mercy, and that choice would echo. She had placed Jonah's immediate need above her safety and accepted the public consequence. The gentle historian, watching from the square's edge, recorded the sequence in quiet notes. Who moved first, who intervened, the carved token's discovery. He did not summarize it. He kept the detail that mattered, the token, the pot, the broken loaf, and the concrete fact that a constable had begun marking names. His presence reminded the town that these small moments were also history, actions that altered ration lists and reputations. Dawn softened the cobbles and pushed lamplight into pale columns. Maria tucked Jonah's small face against her scarf and felt him breathe. The constable folded the page and slid it into his pocket. As they turned away from the square, someone shouted a name from the line. A list was not a full justice, but the list had a power to shift who would be watched next. Maria did not imagine redemption or a new beginning. She imagined a day ahead when she would go out again to the marsh or the ruined field, when she would barter a clasp of herbs for a portion of grain. She imagined counting small mercies. Her hands still smelled faintly of burnt crust and boiled nettle. She had chosen to split a brittle loaf to keep a child alive. That decision changed how the next hour would feel and who would come to the door with requests. At the end of the square, a shadow moved. The constable stepped away from the table and lifted his hand to call for order. The last line of the ledger lay folded in his palm. Maria watched the constable's pen mark the last name and then watched him look up, finishing the act by making his face into an order to the town. She tightened Jonah's scarf and let the square fall behind them. The chapter ends on that concrete beat. A constable closing a ledger, a woman holding a carved token, a child with warm bread in his hands, and Maria walking into daylight with the knowledge that trust had been given and taken in the same breath. Maria and Jonah hauled the sodden sack from the shallow grave as a neighbor stepped forward and spat. "You took it." Suspicion tightened Maria's jaw before she could think. Her fingers found the seam of the sack and held it there. The crowd gathered with boots pressed into mud. Someone had seen fresh earth where the chapel yard had been still the night before. The immediate problem was plain. The town believed its last supplies had been stolen, and the accused pair stood with wet cloth and a heavy weight between them. That suspicion would set every choice that morning. Jonah gripped the sack strap with both small hands. He coughed, half from cold and half from breath held too long. Maria worked a thumb under the leather tie where the sack had been knotted, keeping a steady look on the neighbor who had raised the alarm. The neighbor's face was red with wind and anger. She did not soften when Maria's fingers showed the damp edge of a torn scrap of cloth. The crowd wanted proof, not words. Thomas arrived then, moving through the people with his shoulders square. He held his head as a man used to being listened to, and he did not look surprised to be asked about the missing goods. Elena stepped in before the first question was finished. "Thomas, stop," she said, her voice low and quick. "Let them show what they have." Her hand on Thomas's sleeve was firm. She was trying to change the motion of the crowd. Her calm was an action, not a speech. "Show us then," Thomas answered, stepping forward. "Show us what you bear, Maria. Show us whose work this is." His words hit like a hard coin dropped on wood. The accusation in his tone forced a choice. Hand the sack open here, or hold back and risk a worse accusation. Maria's breath tightened. She pulled the knot a fraction and let the cloth shift so the crowd could see the damp edge of earth and something wrapped in oilcloth. A child cried out from the back. Someone hissed, "Thieves," and the word multiplied until the air seemed measured by it. Elena touched Maria's elbow. Her gesture said more than words. "Keep calm, tell the truth that saves." Maria thought of the day before when Jonah had nearly toppled under a crate of flour in the market. Jonah had lunged for the boiled roots, desperation driving his small hand. And of the night she had scraped roots from a cracked bowl to make a thin porridge. Those earlier moments were not spoken now, but they shaped the move Maria made. She loosened the sack enough for the crowd to glimpse the wrapped shapes inside and let curiosity do the rest. Someone pushed forward, fingers reaching for the oilcloth. A neighbor shouted, "Open it now!" A rapid exchange followed, short lines cutting through the cold. "Thomas, open it!" "Maria, wait. Elena, let her." The neighbor, "We have a right to see." Maria kept the sack closed until Thomas' hand brushed the cloth. That touch changed the temperature of the morning. The contact made the accusation personal. Thomas' thumb left a damp print. The crowd leaned in as Maria rolled back the oilcloth. Inside were small wrapped loaves, a handful of dried herbs, and a sealed packet the size of a coin purse. The sight shifted faces. A thin loaf passed from hand to hand as if the crowd could weigh guilt by the bread's crust. But once the packet was seen, Thomas's jaw went hard in a way that made Elena step closer. The packet had no label. Maria had wrapped it months earlier and tucked it into her coat when she had gone to the marsh. She had meant it for Jonah, to thicken a pot, or to trade for a child's cough medicine. She had not meant to carry it out from the grave. Her fingers had closed over the creased cloth, even as she held the sack open. Now she let it sit where everyone could see it. In the second that followed, the crowd's suspicion split into new directions. Some thought the packet proof of theft. Others wondered if the packet had been hidden for safekeeping. The immediate conflict became a question of ownership. Elena's voice rose clear and deliberate. "Where did these come from?" she asked Thomas, and her tone pulled the attention to the man who had arrived like a judge. "Tell us, Thomas, are these yours?" Thomas' face did not soften. "They are goods I bought and hid for my family," he said. His sentence was a line drawn between two claims: property and community need. The crowd murmured, some supported him at once. Others hissed that a family saving food in a time of famine was theft from the very people struggling outside their doors. A neighbor barked, "You have more than you say." Another voice, younger, called, "They dug for it. They took what wasn't theirs." Exchange followed exchange, 3 to 6 sharp lines where people tried to push others into positions. Dialogue filled the space so that action preceded reflection. Maria felt her mouth go dry. Jonna clung to her skirt and would not let go. Elena moved away, eyes on a different trail. She followed muddy footprints that led from the chapel toward a narrow lane behind the cottages where shutters were still closed. The footprints were small and quick, not like Thomas' heavy boot prints. Elena crouched and found a scrap of merchant cloth snagged on a hawthorn. The thread pattern matched the sash Thomas was known to wear when he took produce to market. She touched the cloth, then held it up so the people could see. The crowd shifted at the new evidence. A new suspicion moved through them. Perhaps the hoard had not come from the marsh at all. Someone, search his storeroom. Now, the command spread like a tide. Thomas' hands went to his belt. You cannot, but Elena shut him down with a look. Her fingers were steady, her jaw set. She had seen scraps of this sort of hiding before and knew the way towns break when food hides in private corners. A small group forced Thomas' back door. Sound changed. The wood creaked, a brace gave, and the lock broke with an animal noise of splintered timber. The crowd held its breath as if breath could hold the moment in place. Inside, sacks rested against a wall, and their rough weave suggested more than the handful of loaves. Someone tore one open, and a cloud of seed dust rose. A second sack was heavier, tied, stacked, and tucked under a bench were loaves wrapped in oilcloth identical to those Maria had shown. Proof hit the faces of the onlookers like cold water. Thomas stood with his hands empty. He did not try to pull the door closed. Elena read him by the way his shoulders folded the slightest degree. She nothing for a beat, then stepped forward and touched the sack with her palm, as if that contact made the weight of the evidence real. A voice from the crowd demanded a reckoning. Thomas, those are for my children. Elena, for your children. Thomas, when the town suffers, where do your children sleep? Thomas. My children have taxes and mouths to feed. They are my family. His voice broke on the last word. The crowd's reaction split again. Some stepped back, feeling the cut of hunger pressing at the father's need. Others shouted that family could not be a shield for hoarding. At that moment, a magistrate arrived on horseback, the paper on his chest forced into a leather folder. He read a decree and held it up like a flat blade. He had a tone that carried the city's law into the town's square. Surrender the hoard for official rationing, the magistrate ordered. This will be divided under my seal. The paper's presence changed the scale of the dispute. It was no longer merely neighbors arguing, but a formal seizure for public need. That command created the chapter's climax. The crowd surged and then braced. Thomas folded his hands and looked at the magistrate as if answers could be given by paper alone. Elena's mouth pressed thin. She moved to stand between the sacks and the people. Maria's hand closed around the small packet again. Her body carried two opposing pulls. Shame for having buried the sack, and the instinct to keep one thing for Jonah. The emotion shifted within her, suspicion became defensive determination, and then, in the span of breaths, a softer resolve. The magistrate's order required Thomas to choose. He had three options. Defy the official demand, admit he had hidden more than he had said, and turn it over willingly. Or sacrifice some portion publicly to show cooperation while keeping a private share. His eyes slid to the crowd. He measured faces he had known for years. The longer he did not choose, the louder the voices became. Thomas, if I open these now, will my household go empty? Magistrate, you will keep as the law allows. Thomas, not in secret. Open them. The town watched as Thomas untied a sack and poured thin measures into a linen sheet. Hands moved forward like clockwork. Some reached for a piece more than once and were stopped by Elena's quick palm. She organized the distribution with an efficiency born of having shared rations before. One measure each. She said, line up. Names first. Jonas, you stand here. Maria, Jonna, you there. Her commands were short and practical. They forced order. During the scramble, a group tried to push past to seize extra portions. A brief scuffle began, 3 quick exchanges of shove and cry. Elena raised her voice and said, no more. Now, Her control returned the crowd to the slow hand of rationing. Jonna clung to Maria's skirt as his bowl was set in front of him. Maria looked at the bowl and then reached into her coat while Thomas watched with a face that had turned pale. She placed the small sealed packet into the communal pot as Alina ladled the first thin gruel. The packet's contents were barley bits and a small pinch of dried root flour, nothing large, but enough to thicken a pot and make a child's portion last an extra day. When someone noticed Maria's gesture, a hush fell. Thomas' face shifted from anger to something close to shame when he realized she had given the last of what she had hidden. He stepped toward her, words forming, but the magistrate cut him with a declarative motion. "Magistrate, the law will be carried out. All hoards will be declared and turned. No private reserves beyond official allotment." Maria did not argue. She felt the relief in Jonna's small shoulders as the gruel touched his lips. Her action changed people's view in a small, precise way. She had been caught with supplies, yes, but she had also chosen to share. The change was not total forgiveness. It was a small rebalancing of responsibility and need. The crowd parted as the magistrate called names and marked down measures with a stub of pencil. The distribution moved slowly, deliberately. Thomas had to watch his own stores emptied to the line he had set. He held his head down as his family's sacks were counted and then marked for the town's rations. For a long moment he stood mute. Then he faced Alina and said, "I thought I could save them." His voice contained the tired arithmetic of a father who had believed secrecy could buy safety. "Alina, we all tried, Thomas. Some hid more, some hid less. We are not clean. We are human." Her words did not absolve Thomas. They placed his choice in the same human ledger as everyone else's. The town had the proof it needed, and the magistrate's ledger would hold the distribution's record. After the measures were passed out, people found themselves sitting on the steps of the main street with bowls and spoons. The thin gruel warmed hands that had been numb-bubbed by the morning. Jonna ate slowly, eyes fixed on the bowl as if it could contain safety. Maria sat with him and caught what she could of his small mouth. The gentle historian stood apart, hands folded on his notebook, watching the human geometry of the circle. He had been there with his soft voice for years, collecting small acts and rehearsing how to speak them without making spectacle. He noted the way Thomas' shoulders eased a fraction when a neighbor offered him a cloth, the same neighbor who had spat accusations at the start. The redistribution had more consequences than immediate filling of bowls. Voices that had been loud in anger turned inward as people measured shame against relief. A woman near the hearth said, "He kept seeds." Seeds, and then stopped as if naming the word moved something too raw. Another man whispered that he had hidden an onion last week. People's submissions came in small bursts, not as confessions so much as asides that shifted who was judged. The community's unity had fractured but not collapsed. It had been reassembled, fault lines included. Night fell with the town quieter than usual. A small circle gathered by a single hearth in a dim kitchen. The scene matched the 15th beat the gentle historian would later describe with a soft tone and patient facts. The group ate the communal gruel made from the distributed seed. Maria fed Jonna by scooping and offering while Thomas sat near Alina, speaking in low words about how he had meant only to keep his children alive. Alina did not offer easy absolution. She had organized the line and held off seizures. She kept a practical distance that also contained a steady kindness. "Thomas, I thought if I kept some back, I could trade it when the roads opened. I thought I could make it through, Alina." "And what would your trade have bought when the town ran out?" she asked. "There would still have been people starving while your family waited." Thomas looked at his hands. "I know." His voice was small. He had been a man used to deciding for others. That morning he had been decided for by law and by the town's will. Maria's small packet had been noticed and then absorbed into the pot. In the hours that followed, a few people came quietly to her and placed folded scraps of cloth or a small dried fish in her hands. They did not speak of her earlier act of taking. They spoke of the present, that Jonna had eaten, that a night's hunger would be less severe for a child. Maria accepted the things with movements that showed she would rather trade shame for the simple arithmetic of filling a bowl. The gentle historian recorded the facts without theta. He noted the ledger the magistrate kept, the bread measures, Thomas's submission, Alina's hands heavy with tasks, Maria's furtive theft turned public gift, and Jonas' bent head at the hearth. He noted also how the town's law, carried by the magistrate paper, had forced a choice that families had been making privately. Keep what you can for your own, or risk your share for the public good. His words would later be soft, focused on what people did and how they moved, because that detail mattered to listeners seeking quiet understanding. The night ended with a small, concrete event that settled the day's tension. A knock came at the back door of the bakery house, where the last of the gruel had been ladled. A man from the next hamlet arrived with a single tin cup and said he had ridden through a night road and found more people whose stores were gone. He held out the cup to Alina as a request, not a demand. The circle around the hearth looked at him. Hands reached. Thomas stood and offered a linen sheet with measured portions. That single action, someone arriving with need and the town responding with what it had, closed the morning sark in a practical way. It was not triumphant. It was a small, exact act of distribution. Maria sat back and felt the bone, deep tiredness of someone who had chosen in public what she could not choose in secret. The morning had begun with a dirty sack and a shouted accusation. It ended with people passing spoons and wrapping bread in cloth for neighbors who had walked miles with empty pockets. The town had exposed its fractures and then, in steps small and careful, attempted to sew them together. By the time the magistrate mounted his horse and the day's ledger was bound and taken to the county seat, Thomas had walked once around the square, nodding to those who had accused him and to those who had defended him. He had to face people he knew, stand to be judged by neighbors he had supplied in better years, and accept the law's measure. He had not been exonerated. He had been required to place his goods where everyone could take a measured share. That public surrender altered how the town would remember him. It did not erase the act of hiding, but it made the consequences visible. Alina walked home at dusk with Jonna on her heels, and she kept one hand near Maria's shoulder as if steadying her. Maria walked with a slow, careful step, the notch of fatigue in her shoulders visible to anyone who looked. Jonna had drifted towards sleep against her chest. In the dawn's first hours, they had taken from earth what they could. By night they had given back a piece of what they held. The gentle historian closed his notebook later that evening and noted the specific, repeatable things that had altered the town's course. The dug patch behind the chapel, the merchant cloth at the lane, the unlocked storeroom with sacks, the magistrate's paper, the ration line, and Maria's small packet dropped into the communal pot. He would speak quietly about how ordinary choices, who to accuse, who to defend, who to share, made survival less a moral sentence than a communal negotiation. The chapter's final event was small and concrete. A councilman tapped the magistrate's ledger with a finger and said, "Record Maria's gift. Let it be counted alongside the others." The magistrate wrote the line, and the clerk closed the book. That simple accounting gave Maria a place in the official record that would later allow her to receive an extra measure when the next distribution came. It did not erase the shame of the morning, but it turned her furtive act into a traceable contribution. As the hearth's embers cooled, the people dispersed. Some walked home with the knowledge of who had hoarded and who had given. Some would trade stories that would harden into judgment. Others would soften in the weeks to follow when seed sprouted where it had been planted. For now, the town had resolved the immediate conflict. The hidden cash had been found, ownership had been exposed, the law had intervened, and the people had redistributed what they could. Personal relationships would take longer to mend, but the chapter's actions had been concluded in public, with concrete records, and with an exchange that left bowls not full but shared. The final image of the evening was not a poetic end, but a clear beat. Elena securing a small sack of saved seed in the town store and handing the key to the magistrate with a look that said the work would continue tomorrow. Maria rose from the hearth and brushed Jonas' hair with a rough hand. Tumas lifted his eyes and met hers once before turning away. The magistrate closed his ledger, and the town, measured by its choices and by the thin bowls now cooling, moved on. The law had settled the immediate scale. The people would live with the moral sums for long after the paper left town. The last concrete action came from Maria. She folded the empty oilcloth and tucked it into her pocket. It was a small act of private reckoning that matched the morning's public one. The morning had begun with a cold, open accusation and ended with a measurable, shared distribution. Every major thread had been pulled taut and then knotted. The accusation that began the day, the trail of cloth that shifted suspicion, the forced entry revealing hoarded sacks, the magistrate's decree that made the climax, and the redistribution that resolved the central conflict. People who had been enemies that morning shared spoons by evening. Maria's choice to contribute her pocketed packet converted private survival into an act that fed one child for a night and entered the town's account as a small, recorded gift. The chapel yard's shallow grave was closed up. The sack's damp contents had been counted and spent. In that closing, the town had done what towns do under scarcity. It named the theft, examined the reasons, enforced a public rule, and then rebalanced survival among those who remained. The chapter ends with a present action rather than a general reflection. Elena locks the storeroom and hands the key and the magistrate's receipt to the town clerk, saying aloud the line that will be written under the day's events. All hoards turned, measures recorded, the clerk nods and ties the receipt into the ledger. That practical custody of the day's record is the final beat, an accounting, a physical closure, and a promise of measurement rather than mystery. The genteel voice of the historian will later tell this as a careful tale of ordinary people making difficult choices. But tonight, the last measure is a ledger entry, a sealed oilcloth, a child's full belly, and a key placed into the hands of a clerk who will keep the town's record of what was taken and what was given. Those are the details that close the morning and set the town to the slow work of living with what they had learned.